Oh. Hello, Darm?
Hey, Patrick, use the chat because this is public right now.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, well, noon, wherever that may be. Really happy for everyone to join in today. Brandy, thanks for joining again. Charles, Christine, Connie, Dana, and everybody else, welcome to Event Technology Week. I am excited to say that this is our last day of the week, and I am sad to say that this is the last day of Event Technology Week. However, I am really, really happy about today's session. It's going to be hosted by Patrick Blattner from Indoor Lab. He's going to be enlightening us with some really cool technologies on what you can do at your show floor. There's always that situation where we don't know where people are going and how to analyze it. And I'm really, really honored to have Patrick as part of our chat. Before I do pass it over, if someone can just put in the chat that they can hear me and see me, and that'll give me a thumbs up to make sure that everyone is communicating well. Please just say yes. Awesome. Thank you very much, Patrick. All right. Patrick, I'm going to pass this off to you. I'm going to make you the host of this panel, and welcome to our Event Technology Week.
Thank you, Dharmesh. So briefly, where do I go to turn it over to my presentation?
Yeah, I'm just doing that right now.
Okay.
There you go. And then on your side, you just have to click on the green button and just share your screen.
Share. Okay. Yes. Yes. Share. I think that's.
There we go.
Okay.
Well, you're sharing your
entire desktop. All right.
Yeah.
First of all, yes, thank you, Dharm, and thank you for everyone attending. We really appreciate it. And let me give you a little introduction. My name is Patrick Blattner. I am the Chief Product Officer and co-founder of the Indoor Lab. The Indoor Lab is made up of two individuals that founded our company, and we have been in the event technology space for tracking people for over 10 years. And what I'm going to do today is take us through a little bit about some of the technologies and the backgrounds on some of the places where we have been tracking people before we got into the event space. And then I'd like to deep dive into some analytics that kind of explain a little bit what's going on and what we've seen in the event space around registration, and then go further into what we call the end-to-end experience on what we've measured so far in the event space as well. So the background here is really, we're going to go through passive technologies and what passive tracking really means. We want to also talk about levels of analysis that we provide. So there are dashboards out there, and then after each event, there are usually anomalies that occur within each event. So we want to talk about some of that and how we kind of uncover anomalies and show some case studies on that. Then we'll go into the on-site registration. Patrick Mooney, my co-founder, and myself have been deeply engaged in queuing, whether it's been with grocery stores, large retailers, or some of the largest airports in the country and actually in the world. And so we've got extensive experience with visualizing queues and understanding the wait times and the impact to the attendees and or the customers or travelers in some cases. And then we'll move deeper into end-to-end benchmarking. We have some ways in which we show visualization across the entire experience that you can kind of use as a benchmark for next year's event, as well as historically we've seen heat maps of different kinds. Many of these heat maps look like weather maps. we're going to show something that's a little bit different than that. We're going to show something called hierarchical or zone heat maps that allow you to roll these heat maps up into measurable examples where you can then A/B test, multivariate test, or compare planograms and floors against each other and engagement from that. And then last, we'll close it off with exception reporting, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions. But I think, Dharm, you're going to be interjecting at times with questions as well. Am I correct?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So a little bit about our background for those of you on the phone who haven't spoken with us in the past. So we have been tracking with some of the largest retailers in the world is where we started off with our previous company, but then we moved into the airport space and tracking people through airports. And even the Empire State Building was one of the customers we were working with. So when you think of tracking across multiple floors, total time to top, things of that nature, and even queuing at the elevator. So we've seen kind of the whole gamut of tracking. And I think the most important thing that I want to kind of highlight here is that in every brand you're seeing to your right here from these technologies, in none of these cases do you ever walk in and sign a TOS agreement, or is anyone handing you a beacon? And there are different things that we can do with tracking technologies to provide end-to-end tracking where you don't have to use a beacon. Now, beacons can provide some more detail, if you will. But at the end of the day, if you just want to dip your toe in the water and understand what's the end-to-end experience, there are other ways to go about it, which we can simply measure from the end-to-end experience without understanding who that person is, but you can see the traffic patterns and trends. So that's one of the things I want to point out here. Every chart and every graph you're going to see today does not require a beacon. So some examples and signals that live tracking is happening today. I wanted to bring these examples up. If you went to any of these websites right now and looked at Orlando, Denver, Phoenix, these were some of our customers in the past that still use the technology we deployed. And it was a combination of Bluetooth sensors that are sniffing devices on you, such as Fitbits and wearables, camera, whether it's optical or infrared. But these live examples right now, if you went to these websites, are updating every 60 seconds. So everyone that's walking through that airport is being tracked. Now, you don't necessarily know who that person is with the capabilities that are deployed here because it's all anonymized. But it just gives you an example that live tracking has been happening for a long time, and it's new to the event space in a big way. And beacons kind of have come about in the last few years, but there are ways to track passively where you don't know who anybody is, but you can still do a lot of key measurements by tracking anonymously. So the hardware in which we use is these things on the left here are battery powered sensors. They're about 4 inches by 9 inches. And our friends at IAEE were really our first launch pad, and that was in December. And if you went to IAEE, you had a beacon. And so many of us are familiar with, sensors being put out throughout the floor and then beacons being attached to your badge. We did the same thing at IAEE. The one thing I want to call out here, though, is that these sensors also pick up Fitbits and wearables. So when you think of just passively sniffing BLE or Bluetooth low energy devices, all of these, whether it's a Fitbit wearable of any kind, they talk a lot. And so they're also sending off signals. And from that, we have pattern matching algorithms that in a case of like IAEE, where people had wearables and people had beacons on their badges, we're able to segment that data and actually measure independently and also eliminate all double counting. And the critical thing here, when we were measuring passively without putting beacons on people in retail and in airports, we were seeing roughly 20 to 25% of all people going through these environments. Now, early on, when it was Bluetooth 2.0, we were only seeing a couple of percent. So we were using statistical companies to validate our data, and then we actually had to go through audits. And the data, even at a couple of percent, which was valid data, came in with 98% accuracy. So now, if you think in terms of an association that really wants to just get a scope of what's happening within their event, you've got well well more than a large enough sample size to actually measure and understand kind of the exact flow of what's happening and where people are engaging. And then the third component, and this is something that my partner and I actually introduced into the airport space for the first time, and we really started working with LiDAR in 2016 and then into 17. But again, our friends at IAEE were the first to allow us to bring it into the event space. And for those of you that were there, you probably saw some screens with dots on them, and that was from LiDAR, and I'll show a little bit about that. Those of you not familiar with LiDAR, LiDAR is the technology that is used for autonomous driving vehicles that keeps those vehicles from running into buildings or hitting people or hitting animals. Well, that same technology can be used for tracking objects. It's completely PII compliant, but it can track people in real time with 3-centimeter accuracy, and it can see out roughly 200 feet. So it's really an interesting technology to bring into certain places within events, if you will, and trade shows. So I want to cover on a couple of things that, you know, we hear a lot in the marketplace, and we've had to deal with a lot in the marketplace, and that is facts on passive tracking. So passive tracking detects a MAC ID address. What we often hear is that people are concerned that we're tracking their smartphones, and that's not the case. If you have a smartphone, you go and pair it with your car, it has to be in pair mode to actually be seeable. So when we're tracking people passively through environments, we see, you know, rarely any phones. I mean, early on, we saw when it was Bluetooth 2.0 in 2009 prior, you could see RIM devices. If they had their Bluetooth on, you could see all of those were seeable. But in today's market, none of the phones are really seeable. So it's really the Bluetooth 4.0 wearables that you see. And of those Bluetooth wearables that you see, Bluetooth 4.0 really came out in 2012, and they've consistently increased, but there is no identifiable information on these wearables. They're just beaconing out and communicating to connect with an app or information around you. So that's the one critical thing I want to bring up is we're not seeing any phones, and it's all anonymized information. So it's you can't unencrypt it and go back and try and uncover who that person is and the name of that person. It's just not plausible or possible. Now, the last piece of this that I want to kind of touch on is that from a legal perspective, and it was starting back in 2011 and 2012, and we were dealing with the Privacy Council in DC. But from a legal perspective, just so you know, moving forward in public spaces, if you are wearing a Fitbit or a wearable or a device that emits or receives a signal in a public space, it's considered implied consent. So tracking then becomes legitimate. So that's a legal perspective. Did you want to say something, Tom?
No, I was just like, that's interesting.
Yeah. So that was the one of the larger retailers we were working with at the time. That was the legal perspective they came back with. So for those of you to show the difference between LiDAR and Bluetooth. So Bluetooth, whether you're walking around with a wearable or a beacon on your badge, we have these sensors set up around these locations, and we turn up the RF signal to a certain size. And then when you walk into those zones, we can detect whether you're there or not. Now, LiDAR, the way this works is this is scanning 360 degrees. It's picking up every object. It spins at 10 rotations a second and throws off 10 positions per second, way more data than you need. But it's highly accurate, and it allows you to scan out in open environments. However, it is line of sight. So if you have to tie 3 or 4 of these together in kind of a mesh network to cover a big facility, that can be done. And we actually did that at IAEE as well with a couple of sensors up by the registration area. So the two types of analysis we found valuable, and we were doing this back in the retail days as well as in the airport days. We have a analytics dashboard that we provide that's custom built from the ground up that is provided to all of the companies that we work with. But in addition, every event we do a deep dive and we do post-event analysis. And some of the most important information we have uncovered came from post-event analysis. And it wasn't even part of really the objectives that we were touching on. It was data that kind of made us scratch our head, like, what is this telling us? And then it became new benchmarks that we started to use and plug into the dashboard as new ways to kind of drive efficiencies or increase revenues, et cetera. And I'm going to show a couple of these from different markets, but also what we're starting to uncover in the event space today. So this is an example from a large airport we used to work with. And we had all the retail covered, and we had the checkpoints covered. And the objectives were to actually measure kind of engagement in retail and understand dwell in retail. But what we saw is an inordinate amount of people that were going straight to security checkpoint. They had retail covered around the security area, but the number was so large, it kind of stood out. And you could see that 94% of the people were going straight to security checkpoint gate. So now if you're a retailer and you're paying money to be around that area, you think you have an audience that's huge. But what really happened was, of the 6% that was remaining, 3% was going to the TSA pre-sign-up office. So now the size of the opportunity for the retailer was only 3%. So from this information, the airport since this, now this is a few years ago, but the airport since this is using this information in the new redesign of their main terminal. And all of the security checkpoints are going to be up in the departure area, and all retail is going to be pushed back behind security checkpoint. Now, non-aeronautical revenue is of huge importance to airports, especially since the Ubers and Lyfts came out. It's really impacted the parking fees and things of that nature. So they're looking for any way to actually kind of spur new non-aeronautical revenue. So this information, these findings that were uncovered post-analysis actually became benchmarks to help them in the redesign. So I'm going to touch on DARM's world a little bit, the registration world. So if I say anything, DARM, that you don't like, you can put me on mute.
No, that's fine.
So for those of you who were at Expo, you may have seen these screens around. And what you're seeing here is dots. This was inside the hall. These dots are people. We just had, dots of different colors to represent people. Here was our booth, and we had one LiDAR sensor sitting here on our booth. And the interesting thing to note here is, look at how far it was picking up these people way out here, moving around. I'm going to go ahead and click this here. So this is what the LiDAR sensor, it's like a half the size of a Folgers coffee can. And you can see these dots moving around, and on the video, it's a little sketchier than what it was in real life. But I just want to kind of show, this was around security, or not, this is around registration. But these dots picked up 3 centimeter in real time. And what we saw happen were people were walking up to these screens and they were moving back and forth, and they could see their dot moving. And that's how responsive it was and how accurate it was. And the reason we happened upon LiDAR early on when we brought it into the airport space before we got into the event space is that it does a lot of things that cameras can't even do. So it works horizontally versus overhead. We can set them up on tripods quickly, and we can mesh them together, and then you can start to collect real-time information around the registration area. It works in low and high ceilings. It's not susceptible to shadowing effects or lighting conditions in big atriums where in the afternoon the sun comes down and shines and it creates reflections. And then the range, these things have 360-degree view and range out 200 feet. So you can set a broad area up in very short order. And then if you wanted to look outside, not really for this situation, but it works in rain, snow, dust. It also works in nighttime. And the good thing about it is it's object detection. So there is no PII associated with it. But it's really an impressive technology. And here's ways in which it can be used from a registration perspective.
Hey, Patrick, what's PII?
That is personal identifiable information.
Okay, cool.
So we don't see your face. We don't know who you are. And what you're seeing here is this is a structured queue on the left where you have stanchions. And over to the right is an example of unstructured queues. So let's say you had some people that were line busting where you had them standing out here and they had a tablet and they were trying to check people in. This is a whole self-serve area. Then you have kiosks over here. Well, LiDAR allows you to actually not only track the people and the behavior, the rate of movement, the velocity of travel, how much time they were spending at each of these locations within this kind of ingress and egress checkpoint area, if you will, but you can replay all of this information. So you can start to see where the bottlenecks happen. And this is where it becomes really quite interesting. So if you wanted to do A/B testing, multivariate testing, you wanted to test, for example, facial recognition versus other technologies, this can simply be used to actually help you understand throughput at each of those areas. So it's really a multi-purpose, multi-capability technology. And we're very excited about what we can do with it in the event space. So now when you think about, let's say, Javits is a great example. Javits is huge. And so you would have multiple registration areas if it's a big event, for example, a consumer show of some kind. But the way that would look like from a technology footprint setup is you would have all of these registration areas, and then you would set up these LiDAR sensors, and you can set them up every probably 300, 400 feet. One device every 300 to 400 feet. So it covers a really broad area. Now these devices are actually seeing out, way out, probably beyond what the checkpoint is or the people that are standing in line. So it's constantly pulsing and giving you information. From there, you can start to visualize what these queues look like. And so now you've got all of these queues that are sitting within time windows in these dots. So it's all PII compliant. And you can see kind of when the problem areas were and within which registration areas, but you can replay all of this information. If you think about real time into the future, to have this in your hand, if you're managing an event and you see that there is a problem at one of the registration areas and you want to load balance the lines in the queues, you can be alerted and notified that, hey, this just hit into the 18 to 21 minute threshold, and then try and tailor and bring those people over into the lower line threshold areas. So that's one way that TSA was using it in the past, but this just gives you a way in which you can think about visualizing this information that becomes not only a visual cue from color standpoint, but also gives you a visual view of the dots. So now, when we start talking about analytics, and this is the area that both my co-founder and myself have extremely detailed information in the world that we came from, and this is much like the event space. You've seen one airport and you've seen one airport, and that's the same with these events. You've seen one event in the registration area, and the other one is completely different. You've got high ceilings or low ceilings, all of these issues, right? So when we start to look at what's happening at registration and people are looking at wait times and the average wait times, it really doesn't give a clear picture. And the reason that is because lines ebb and flow. Think of it in terms of a slinky. So it grows really quickly. If you had a bunch of people get off a bus and the first guy is going to take 4 minutes and the last guy is going to take 20 minutes, well, within a very short period of time, they're going to have completely different experiences. So averages really do not give the complete picture. So what we're going to do is show you kind of what it really looks like on these ebbs and flows, these highs and lows, and then how to measure it to see the total impact to the attendee. So this is kind of what it really looks like. So you can see that some people were waiting 40, 50 minutes, and then it drops down, then it goes up, then it drops down. And it's just really, and this is standard in any of the queues we've seen throughout the airport environment and what we're now seeing within the event space. Well, now if you want to actually say, okay, but what's the real impact? Like what's the experience my attendees had? You can use a wait time distribution curve to quickly, simply, and summarize this information. Here's what that looks like. So you have time windows here on the left or on the bottom of the chart, 0 to 3 minutes, 3 to 6, 6 to 9. And it tells you the percent of people that were impacted by or stood in line for those periods of time. And so now it gives you all of this long tail as well. And so if you had to report back and start to benchmark and understand, okay, so this was this year, but let's make sure we improve that for next year. And so you can see if you wanted to set your benchmark at 12 to 15 minutes or 15 minutes, you can see anyone north of that, it was roughly 30% of the people were waiting more than 15 minutes. So that's a very simple way to benchmark and understand total impact to the attendees. And then you can look at it by day 1 versus 2 and 3 as well. So here is an example of anomaly, and I'm going to translate this to the event space here in a moment. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is because we saw this behavior start to happen in the event space. We originally saw it with one of the largest grocery chains in the country. And what we call it is lane hopping. And in this example, so think of yourself at a grocery store and you're standing in line and all of a sudden they open up another line. So you jump to that line, but a guy gets in front of you. Well, that scenario seems like not too much of a measurement, right? But we saw that 18.1% were lane hopping at this grocer. Well, here's where the little things add up. So this grocer had 4,000 customers a day. And of that, 18% were lane hopping. That turns out to 265,000 customers per year were impacted by lane hopping. Well, here's the kicker. Well, the time that was impacted by those customers, it added 2 minutes and 14 seconds onto their time. Well, when you really add that up, that's, 9,800 hours or roughly 412 days for one store. So if you're thinking in terms of taking some small incremental shifts to improve the experience for the customer, this is one that really kind of stood out, because now you multiply that by the 300 stores within this chain, and it's a big number. And the reason I bring this up is because of this. We saw, or not only saw, but we are seeing, and we've seen it now in multiple occasions where you have pre-registration versus registration, and this can be managed by proper signage and proper flow into the event to make sure that people aren't confused. But we saw roughly 12 to 25%. Right now it's a big window because we only have a few examples of it. And we're seeing impact of an additional 5 to 15 minutes per attendee. Well, if you just take an example of, let's say there are 10,000 attendees at 12%, only 1,200 are impacted, but on average, roughly, let's say that adds another 10 minutes, which turns out to 200 hours, which equates to almost 8.5 days. So it's another way to think about benchmarking and reducing what could be a bad experience for people. And you can do that by proper signage, having people placed in the proper areas to make sure that they don't go through this experience. But I didn't actually even think that this was going to be an issue in the event space, but this was post-analysis where as we were starting to look at the data, we started to uncover some of these anomalies in the data, and that's why this became, or kind of crept back up. And we wanted to show kind of how we first came about this or found this metric, and then how it's starting to show itself in the event space as well. So with all of this information coming in, back in the day, we created a bid for the government to manage all 165 queues for the top airports in the country. And we ended up winning it for TSA. And then, of course, we left to start the indoor lab. So we didn't follow through on it. But at the end of the day, it was based on resource modeling. And so if you think in terms of, here's the time of day, 7 a.m. here to 5:45 here. And right here, what you're looking at is the demand. This is the number of attendees we expect to hit at these certain times of day. Well, here is per resource what the throughput is. So for every 15 minutes, I have one person at my registration area. What is their throughput per person? And that's what I don't know, but that's what the registration company would have to input. And then you can see here, this is the number of staff you need. So with this demand here, this then shows you a resource demand chart, if you will, throughout every 15-minute increment. And if you play this, if you dial this resource number up and down based on their throughput capabilities, the chart automatically changes, and you can clearly see where you're starting to reach peak, where you need more resources or less resources. And this is where, starting to measure what's happening at registration and then applying this to next year's event can help you set up registration in a way in which you can increase the facilitation of flow through registration to create a much more seamless experience. I know I hear frictionless experience. Well, you can't fix what you don't measure. And so we're big fans of measuring things so you can fix and improve them. So end-to-end tracking. So one of the things here that we've called out is all of the analysis on the left side, whether we're talking about the first location visited upon entrance, pathing through the show, planograms, and understanding kind of where people are really engaged versus just visited. All of this behavior is very easy to do without beacons. So on the left side, beacons are necessary, or beacons are not necessary. And on the right side, when you want to get down to lead gen, understanding, C-level versus VP, or if you're talking about personas, then you're going to want to beaconize people. But at the end of the day, it's not required to get a first pass and understanding of what's happening at your event. So that's kind of, I got to ask Dharm, is this going to be available to people on the call?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So this is going to be a snapshot of kind of an end-to-end event that can be used as a benchmark snapshot. So what we're talking about here is from the time you enter the convention center, you go through registration, the exhibit hall, the amount of time spent at the exhibitor booths, not in the aisles, but at the exhibitor booths, the time spent in sessions, and then in the common areas. That's really the end-to-end experience. So how do you actually capture that in a picture, if you will? So here's how you do that. We have time windows again on the left, and these can be adjusted. So this is really time of engagement, if you will. And so now this is rank of category. So of course you can't be in the exhibit hall unless you're in the convention center, right? So when you set this up, it's really based on kind of time and level of engagement. And then that kind of tells you what rank you're going to have on the categories on the top. And so simply you can clearly see here, this is what's happened. This is a heat map of the total time with distribution spent within the convention center, then in the exhibit hall, then at the booths, then at the sessions, registration area, and then these common areas over to the right. So you can use this as year one, and then next year as you're making changes and adjustments, you can compare it against this experience because you've got to the percentage measurements of engagement. And it depends on what your objectives are, but if your objectives are to get more people into the exhibit hall or engaged with more booths, this is an easy way to quickly look at it across the end-to-end experience. And again, I keep highlighting the fact that don't have to have beacons. I just want to make sure that, as we talk about these things, there are barriers to entry, and a lot of them are costs. And this is an example of something that can be done without that additional cost, if you will. So let's talk a little bit about heat maps. And we were dealing with this, in the retail days early on, and then of course in the airport days as well. And many of the heat maps that you see out there are density or saturation heat maps versus what we call regional or hierarchical heat maps. So it really looks like a weather map, right? And I just pulled some from, online here, and we know what they look like. We've seen many of them, and everyone feels, well, we've got to have them because they have one. So everyone displays kind of high saturation areas, if you will. Well, the way we think about it is more like a regional map. So, and I'm going to use a retail example from a high level, but if you think of, and let's just use Best Buy. Best Buy has a national footprint of 1,000, some 100 stores, right? Well, there's a global view of what that looks like. And then they have different regions, if you will, throughout the country. And inside each of those regions are districts. And inside each of those districts are stores. Well, you can create a heat map of what that looks like based on conversion or visits. And when you start to create those hierarchies, you can do a lot more with heat maps. So in this case, this must be some kind of a voting heat map, but it's very similar to how we approach it. So when we do a heat map, it's all region-based. So we've structured all of our content to basically be able to draw over the top of these maps. So whether you wanted to do aisles, whether you wanted to do visits by booth, leads by booth, dwell time, or extended engagement, it becomes very easy, and you can quickly reorganize the data, and you can create higher levels of hierarchies on top of it. So that's a region-based heat map versus a density or saturation heat map. So I'm going to jump over to tracks for a moment, because we used to do A/B testing across multiple planograms, and there was a lot of different behaviors we would see based on that. So the type of track can actually make a big difference on how much you buy or where you engage within stores. Now, if you've been through a good example, you see down here, it says serpentine not shown. If you go through an IKEA, that's one example. IKEA is a serpentine, so you got to follow the family in front of you, and you got to zigzag through this entire experience to get out. That works for some people, doesn't work for me. So the last time I was at an IKEA was about 5 years ago. But but that's one example of a track of a different kind, if you will. And then if you go into a Costco, the interesting thing about Costco, many of those you walk in and you go left, but what keeps you going throughout Costco is they've got the stations with food, especially on the weekends, so it gets you to circle the whole thing. But now in the case here, where I just pulled some examples off the web, what you see here in these tracks, these are two types of electronic retailer, for example. And you would see people come in and you would see them walk around. And normally people go right unless you have them directed to go left. And then in some cases where they have these center aisle tracks, many people went up and through the center to get to the back, because one of the most prominent places to visit was the home theater areas, if you will, within this electronics retailer. So now over to the right, you can see a traditional track. And so what happens here is that you have people that go around the track, but then what ends up happening when you start to look at behavior over time, they tend not to branch out from those areas too much. They kind of hang close to the track and not get deep into categories. And so the interesting thing about the previous slide I'm talking about, where you set up regions, is you can now go to a higher level and create a heat map on top of this. And this is what we call a quadrant heat map. And so now if you lay a quadrant over the top of this and not just focus on each zone, but what you really care about in this world is really what is, and this is purely a retail metric. It's not necessarily the case here, but it was all about conversion per square foot or engagement per square foot, right? So what we learned was something called the 70-30 rule. We saw that the majority of people and the behavior, and it was somewhat based on track type, basically went right, and they engaged with about 30% of the store footprint. So 70% of the traffic deeply engaged with 30% of the store footprint. So if you got a 60,000 square foot store and most of the people are engaging only with 30% of the footprint, it's time to start looking at the marketing mix or the different categories you have in the store to get the most bang for your buck and to make sure that people are starting to track more of the store. So that's a metric that we wanted to see, okay, does that carry over to the event space? And first of all, let me go into one more example of a different type of retailer, but it held true in this retailer. And this is what we call a footprint heat map. So if you look over the top of this and you want to see where people are going by time of day and by category, you can simply use a footprint heat map where you've got the key categories covered. You can see the time of day going across the top, and you can see the clear saturation and when the peak hours were. Now, this helps inform where you put the staff, because you want to make sure that your staff is engaging with the customer in this retail environment. But also it begs that question of, do we have the right categories? Because if you take this information and you roll it up, this also follows a 70-30 rule, and it was a completely different type of retailer. It wasn't about electronics. But if you roll those up, you can clearly see that fashion and house and home and electronics really made up the majority of the traffic. And then you start to question whether you should even have these other categories. But this is different ways in which you can leverage heat maps and think about things as people are trekking through these different environments at events. And when you think about tracks and taking track behavior and setting it up to make sure you path people through certain areas to try and drive engagement, we can learn or take a lot from these environments where they've been doing this for years and it's been measured for years. So now from the perspective of an event, use that same logic and that same thought process. And here's where it got interesting for us. So looking at a sensor at every booth, and then you use one metric, and let's say the metric is visits per booth. And you start to do a heat map across all the booths, and you say, okay, a visit is someone who spends more than, let's say, a minute and a half in each booth. We're going to count that as a visit, someone who is engaged. But if you take that information and you say, okay, well, maybe that's someone who's engaged, but what's deep engagement? Maybe that deep engagement number is 5 minutes. Well, what you see when you start to roll this information up is all of a sudden numbers start to really become clear. And so if you put a quadrant over the top of this, you can then say, okay, deep engagement versus regular engagement of a minute and a half. Is there any new insights and information that's uncovered? And you can clearly start to see that there are certain areas where people are more and more engaged than in other areas. So it starts to kind of highlight opportunities or ways to think about, okay, what's being done in these areas where people are deeply engaged? And can you think about maybe placing, high trafficked companies and or categories closer together with some that aren't trafficked as much to help spill over to get other exhibitors more engagement, if you will. And I know the way that trade shows are set up today because I've been going to them for years, but there are maybe ways in which this data can help rethink planograms or layouts or track types is really the key point here. And then from there, you can see from a footprint heat map as well, when you start to look at that across the hours, you can then tie things in like the percent, the square foot, and then the visit per square foot, and that can also be transferred and translated over to leads, et cetera. So there's just a number of ways to view the data and slice the data. And here's the interesting thing too, it's not too far from the 70-30 rule when you start to look at it certain ways in which we've seen for years and years and years and years. So we'll see. We've got a few events under our belt right now, but we'll see if this holds true as we move forward. I'm sorry, did someone have a question?
No, not yet.
Okay. So first visit. So again, taking from the world of, multiple categories within a big box area, one of the things that was very clear was that every week a circular went out. And when that circular went out, if there was a price, product, and offer that was highly attractive to people, what you saw was the first place people went was in that category where that price, product, and offer was highly attractive. And that was one way all of this information from first visit was tied to the marketing, communications, and circular that went out into the market. So from an event perspective, depending on what the objectives are of your event and when you're setting up the show, we believe that the track type, the signage, and the engagement areas can now be measured. And ultimately, we think that higher engagement can actually be attained by starting to measure these areas, much like we were doing kind of in the retail space, if you will. And in this event, where the entrance was located, you can clearly see the first places people visited, and you can start to measure that. So with sensors deployed in the right places based on the objectives, you can start to see not only traffic, not only dwell, but different levels of heat maps and different ways in which you can think about track types and planograms to, I guess, achieve objectives, if you will. And I think that's what we have from the heat map side. We have a lot more information on this front. If anyone wants to reach out to us on our website in the contact form, please feel free, and we'll be happy to give you more information. So now we also do things like exception reporting. And What that means is, for example, you can see the percent of people that never entered the hall, the people that did not visit a booth, or the people that did not visit a session, as an example. Sometimes these are the metrics you really want to drive down versus, hey, I want more people to go to this, I want more people to go to that. Sometimes it's really the reverse of that you want to look at as far as metrics you want to track. And an example of this, and here's kind of how we come to this, is in an airport space, and many of us can identify with this, is that we were seeing an inordinate number of people coming into the terminal and going straight to gate. 80% either went into the terminal, did not touch retail, and or went straight to gate. And when you correlate that with flight data, such as a low-cost carrier, then you can also see, for example, that of the 20% that did touch retail or did at least go into retail, they only went into retail with a $6 or less spend point. So when we think of the event space and correlating other data sets, you can start to uncover really unique metrics. But this is really, again, based on exception reporting from a retail perspective, or if you're in charge of, of the facilities that's handling the retail side and the merchants, you really want to drive down that number of 80% did not touch retail. And it was really based on brand type that was associated with those terminals as well. So just another way to think about it, but these are ways in which you can leverage data also in the event space. And then I think the last component here that I wanted to touch on is, our dashboard really covers a bevy of information, from trending to visits to dwell and repeats. And without beacons, this information can also be attained. So things that you're seeing here, such as visit information on sessions per day, exhibitors, booth visits, the average dwell times, as well as repeats, all of this information can be obtained without beacons. But again, like as I was talking about before, if you want to get to that deeper level of granularity and start to do personas and understand kind of engagement by different level of executive, that's where you want to then apply the beacons to kind of get to that deeper level. So now, from the background in technology and summary, as I've kind of hit on throughout here, beacons are not necessary for end-to-end. The passive detection can provide insights to understand the end-to-end behavior, and what I just talked about, the segmentation for lead gen and level of executive. Now, from an on-site registration standpoint, we can A/B test all different types of queues, all different types of technologies being used at queues, such as facial recognition. And you can do a lot of modeling to not only prove that out, but modeling to start to forecast the future, if you will, to improve the flow and make sure you're resourced appropriately. And then lastly, the end-to-end tracking information around data mining and reporting is probably one of the things that we've become really good at, is not only handing off that dashboard and providing that overview of what the dashboard provides, but really uncovering that needle in the haystack, or those anomalies in the data that really start to kind of, you start by scratching your head, and then what usually happens is it becomes something that we didn't even expect was happening, that becomes a new benchmark. And then the last point I would bring up is data visualization in foot traffic analysis. We have learned has been critical. Mashing up data is critical, but the visualization of this information, it's really been difficult for companies to kind of gain traction just with standard dashboards, and this is where I think we've been able to thrive in the past, is because we focused on this external analysis in addition to the dashboards that we provide, that we then provide in addition with our dashboard, like I said, after every event as well. So now let's see, where did I land on time on this?
I'm pretty good. You got 10 minutes for Q&A.
Perfect. Okay.
And again, thank you, Patrick, for a great presentation. A lot of stuff there, a lot of insight, really exciting stuff, actually. And anyone else have any questions that would like to ask Patrick? I know there's a lot of detail and a lot of good knowledge. Just trying to see if there's any questions at all. Well, Patrick, I have a question for you, actually. One thing that you didn't mention was how, I know we focused a lot on anonymous data within this presentation. One thing to also discuss is maybe kind of highlight how tying that with opted-in data like beacons and stuff like that, how a lot of this information could also help drive different type of metrics as well, like such as lead sharing, requesting for leads, all that kind of information as well, right?
Yeah, and that's that, you know, as I was looking at the time that we had available to us and what we wanted to report on, there is a whole lead gen side of this thing, and where it can be a whole hour in itself. You know, look, the most important thing that we want to get out of going to shows, because I would pay for and go to 20 shows a year prior to us getting into this space, and at the end of the day, it was all about generating business, and that came through leads. And by capturing all of that information, one of the things that we do just from a high level is, as people enter your booth, you then get a report on who those people were, not from their name per se, but you get a report on, for example, you're an executive with Target, and then I, as an exhibitor, can reach out to that person, and if that person accepts, it unmasks the rest of his data, so it's privacy compliant.
Yeah.
But clearly that is a part of our model. I think the one thing I wanted to bring up in this presentation, though, is there are a lot of companies that are just trying to dip their toe in the water and understand what can, this behavioral tracking do for me. And instead of thinking about going all in and all of the additional costs, for example, that beacons bring into the mix, this is a starting point. Especially from an association standpoint, you can start with just uncovering the baseline data passively, and then you can decide to move into the beacons in the future. Because at the end of the day, you also want to make sure that the exhibitors are happy, and they're happy because they get leads. So it can really be a twofold scenario where people can opt in for beacons, and or you can pay for the beacons, or you can just do the passive side as well in addition. So it's just a lot to talk about, Dharm, in an hour.
No, I understand. I just wanted to highlight that that's the case. So we have a lot of questions coming in. I just want to make sure we rifle through them in the next 6 minutes. The first question here we have is, what have you seen? Thank you, Scott, by the way. What have you seen as the primary differentiator in rolling out in a trade show environment versus the retail environment?
Wait, say that again?
What have you seen as the primary differentiator in rolling out in a trade show environment versus the retail environment?
Yeah. Well, it's set it and forget it in a retail environment, but we would have to go in a night and set up from 1 in the morning until 5 in the morning in off hours, and we had to do that same in the trade show environment. But here's the one thing we learned, and it was at IAEE when we got our eyes open to it. When you remove sensors that are collecting data, backhaul data, if you don't have the right staff or pick up the sensors quick enough, you have high breakage. And what that means is if you're running around forklifts to get your sensors, that's not a good thing. So we learn to staff appropriately and when to pick the sensors up appropriately. But what that also led us to is we now have a path to scale. So it taught us how to deploy this from a partner perspective to where we are not involved in the deployment of our sensors into the future is the direction. But that's the big difference is, boy, you got to set this stuff up quick. And we're used to doing that. We just weren't used to tearing down as fast. So that's it. Yeah.
That's great. So Sharon, thank you for this question, because I know exactly where you're going with this one. Sharon and I do some work together already. The question is, can this technology be used to determine a quorum for a meeting if all delegates entered through a designated door. So for example, what happens is you'll have a whole bunch of people coming into this session or this meeting, but there's only a certain amount of folks that are tagged as voting members. So as they enter, that's how it's recognized to be part of a quorum. So they have to hit a certain number. So I'm assuming this is more beacon related.
That's more beacon related, yeah. So you can tag everyone with a beacon and get that information and segment that out, correct?
Exactly. So Sharon, for this case, if you wanted to have the tracking of those specific individuals, there could be a solution where we just track those voting members only by themselves, not everybody. Then at least you're still tracking the voting members to see what the quorum has been met for that particular meeting. Hopefully that answers your question. The next question here is from Eric. What's the average size event you see this technology used in?
Well, right now we've seen it anywhere from, when you say average size event, are we talking about attendees? Is that how you guys?
Yeah, probably.
Do that? Anywhere from 2,000 attendees to 30,000 attendees. The way that we are planning on deploying in the future, and in our approach to scale, will make it unlimited.
Yeah.
So so we have an answer to getting to the largest trade shows out there. Yeah,
that's awesome. Great question, Eric. Appreciate that. And the last question I have here is from Katie. This is a good one. Do you put sensors overhead to see the action in a trade show?
No. All the sensors are actually, from the case of IAEE, many people didn't even see them. The sensors, well, let's just talk about the two types. So the LiDAR sensors in themselves, we set them, and I'll use IAEE as the example, but where registration was, where StreamPoint was doing registration, we just had two of them set up on the back of the registration build, and that's where they were. But they were set up at about 8 feet high, and we've also set them up on tripods on back walls, but they're not in any place where people would run into them or have issue with them. So that's what LiDAR would be set up as. From a sensor perspective on the Bluetooth side, these can be under chairs. They can be hidden at the back side of the booth. It's really think of it as a makeup compact case. That's about the size of it, and they're very kind of hidden, if you will, so you wouldn't even see them. But they are on the floor for the most part, or close to the floor.
That's great. Yep, that was a great question, actually. Awesome. So if there's no more questions for now, I'm sure questions may come later. Feel free to directly contact Patrick. So that's pblattner@theindoorlab.com. Sharon, if you want to talk a little bit more about that quorum thing, just hit me up and then we can talk about that. So that'll be great. And for anyone else, thank you for being part of this great conference. Couldn't have done it without you guys. And hopefully on the next one, we'll make it bigger, better, and more exciting too. I don't know if we can do it, but equally or more, let's shoot for that. So again, thanks everybody for joining us and making event technology a great success for us. Really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you.
No worries. Thank you, Patrick, as well for being part of this. And we'll send everybody a wonderful thank you for everyone that has attended the session as well throughout the week. Okay, great. Thank you. And have a great one. Cheers.